February 6, 1952. Dear Wib. Started for Baptiste's at 9:45. Very nice. Sunny and frosty and the skiing fast. The sled on a rope over my shoulders seemed to have no weight at all. Went the usual way until I came to Rabbit Point. Then, instead of going by the old stable and the railway track, I followed the ice all the way past Sam Baptiste's. Tracks on the ice from his place on. Smoke coming from Sam's stovepipe. First sign of human life I'd seen in exactly a week. I hear the whistle of the train, usually 3 times a week, and the high, whining note of a power saw across the lake and back in the bush where peavers are cutting wood. But that is all. No one on the ice. No one ashore. No tracks except my own and the animals.
To David Milne, his work, his art came first, before comfort, before companionship, before security or recognition. He enjoyed all these things. He was a civilized man, but he often sacrificed them to the central purpose of his life, painting.
For most of my painting life, I've been cut off from other painters. A natural craving for intercourse with others interested in the things that interest me has been suppressed. Its only outlet has been in letters. My share of the letters deal with almost everything, from what I had for breakfast to what I saw through train windows. But most of them deal largely with the painting that's going on at the time. This practice of holding inquests on my own pictures may or may not have been an aid to painting. It has at least been an absorbing spare time occupation and makes some kind of record of how one painter has looked at things from day to day.
Milne always had the need to use words as well as paints. His letters were often rewritten and polished. He worked on an autobiography, and for several long periods he kept journals in which he set down the detail of his day-to-day activity and environment and his reflections on every aspect of his art. David Milne was born in 1882 on a farm in Ontario's Bruce County.
A nice place to be born in, at least to grow in. Thrilling, mysterious, exciting place. From the top of a stump on that hill, we could see mostly everything. Our own fields, Finney's pasture and berry patch, another farm, and the valley through which the Saugeen River flowed. Brown's farm, very small and faint, and beyond that, the sandhills. From that stump, for the first time, I came face to face with infinity, where anything might be and anything might happen.
There were 6 children in the Milne family, and David was the youngest. His first words were Gaelic, learned from the Scottish farm folk who were his parents. Because his brothers and sisters were considerably older, he spent much of his early childhood with his mother, following her around the flower garden she delighted in. And quite early, Milne began to draw.
I don't know what turned my thoughts in this direction. There has never seemed to be an adequate explanation. Drawing was the only subject I ever failed at public school. Perspective and copying never seemed to interest me. But I kept up my interest in drawing on my own. I'm sure there wasn't the faintest sign of promise in any of this. Worse was to come. I started a correspondence course in art. It took me years and years to get over the damage done by that. I think it must have been meant as a commercial art course, but at that time I didn't know there was any difference between commercial art, illustration, and painting. Art was all one to me.
Milne went through normal school and became a public school teacher near the family home at Paisley, Ontario. But when that New York Correspondence School of Art announced it was opening a real school, he quickly made a decision which determined the course of his life.
I started off eager for adventure, perhaps, but knowing no more about my destination than if I had been plunging into the sun.
The Ontario farm boy, now 21, arrived in the big city. It was summer 1903. Innocently, Milne paid his fees for the whole term and lost them when the art school closed down after a few weeks. So he moved on to the fiercely independent Art Students League of New York.
There I was in Frank Dumond's life class, portfolio propped between the legs of an upturned kitchen chair, a piece of charcoal in one hand and a chamois skin in the other, putting down my slightly distorted and feeble version of God's noblest work. From the work of the instructors at the League, I learned nothing that has been of value to me in painting. The instructors were craftsmen, competent, practical. Art to them was bricklaying, only more complicated and difficult. Fortunately, the ideals of their students were higher than their own. There were separate classes for men and women, at least in life classes.
At night the first year, David Milne paid his way by doing show cards for East Side tailors. He would walk miles down 2nd Avenue in an evening, seeking orders from every likely store. Occasionally, he would get an assignment for a commercial illustration. But it was a frugal life he led, sharing with another young artist named Amos Engel a modest studio where they lived and cooked illegally. In New York, David Milne began to paint in earnest. The early part of the 20th century was an exciting time in America. Everything was changing, and there was plenty to argue about wherever there were new directions in the arts, especially in New York. In 1905, photographer Alfred Stieglitz, along with photographer and painter Edward Steichen, had created an important gallery at 291 Fifth Avenue, where the avant-garde of America and Europe was exhibited.
The stirring of the wind before the storm. We heard rumblings of a new order. We were seeing those thrilling exhibitions at the Stieglitz 291. In those little rooms under the skylights, we met Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Matisse, Picasso, Brancusi. For the first time, we saw courage and imagination bare, not sweetened by sentiment and smothered by technical skill. We may have been a nuisance to the dealers, but they put up with it. They never knew where the next crop of artists might come from.
Milne, the artist, still survived, just on commercial work. And a job providing display material for a drugstore introduced him to his future wife. She was May Hegarty, known as Patsy, and she was an office clerk in the store. During their courtship, even the briefest separation would find Milne writing tender, adoring letters.
Dear little sweetheart, I have just about long enough to take you in my arms and kiss you. How I wish we could say goodbye again, even if it were only for a moment, as we did in the station. Did you mind, Patsy? I'm going to send you a note written on the train. I shall have to use pencil, but you won't mind that, will you? I hope you're having a good time. Patsy, you're the loveliest little girl in the whole world. Goodbye, darling. Dave.
Milne courted Patsy for 6 years before their marriage, and she appeared in many of his paintings. This one is in watercolor, a medium Milne and Engel were now using often.
It didn't take many years of rejected or accepted but not hung to drive us to watercolor. Watercolor exhibitions were less rigid. The idea still prevailed that watercolor wasn't a serious medium. Before long, we were getting criticisms in the newspapers. David B. Milne's Hepaticus and Jack in the Pulpit show that he is an economical young man with medium, and also that his flowers must have been badly wilted when he set about painting them. The defiant maple of David Milne is clever, if bilious. It didn't matter whether the critics said we were good or terrible. The views carried no weight, but they tickled our vanity and gave us hope for the future.
The masterpiece of Milne's New York paintings is set in Columbus Circle. An oil from 1912, it's called Billboards, but evidence suggests that under the title Columbus Circle, it took part in a landmark event of art in North America, the International Exhibition of Modern Art, or as it's long been known, the Armory Show of 1913. It contained over 1,200 American and foreign paintings and sculptures representing the progression of modern art from Goya onwards. Post-Impressionists such as Gauguin and Van Gogh were alongside Matisse, Braque, Picasso, Brancusi. Marcel Duchamp stopped traffic with his nude descending a staircase. The show was the talk of the town. It was justification and inspiration to a whole generation of artists. David Milne had 5 works in the show, and his friend Engel had 2.
We were quite overlooked in the outcry against or for the Frenchman. In fact, we pretty well forgot about ourselves in the most thrilling of exhibitions. Apparently, it had little direct effect on my own painting, perhaps because I was already familiar with much of it. Even more because I had my feet quite firmly planted on a path of my own.
As a result of his inclusion in the Armory Show, Milne found his oil paintings being accepted for exhibit by New York's prestigious Montross Gallery. This in turn brought publicity and encouragement to work more in oils.
There was just one disappointing, even disquieting thing about all this. We never sold any pictures.
Milne's work on exhibition caused one man to seek him out. He was another artist named James Clark, who, like Milne, would have to choose between commercial illustration and painting. Clark was to become a famous illustrator and also a lifelong friend and supporter of David Milne.
When I went to New York, I'd never seen any paintings of importance. Probably thought painting and illustrating was the same thing. I tried it for a while. The idea was illustrate to make a living, use the life to paint with. I had some success, but by that time my mind was firmly fixed on painting, and I found that painting and illustrating were two quite different things. I wasn't adaptable enough to jump from one to the other. I resigned myself to making a living at whatever work I could do that wouldn't influence the painting, in order to follow the painting wherever it led, always hoping the living end would get some help from the painting end. It has, a little, but so slowly I would have been discouraged if I'd known it at the time. One doesn't take these vows of poverty willingly.
Poverty, adjustment to married life, fruitless exhibitions. They all took their toll of Milne and his work, as is seen in his paintings from the Bronx.
Painting half the time and making a living in the other half seemed a little too much for me. I thought it was affecting my health. So it was, but not permanently. The trouble was that my painting had taken an unfortunate turn, maybe reflecting a troubled frame of mind.
In 1916, David Milne decided it would be wise to leave New York altogether. He and his friend Clark set out to find a country place to fit Milne's specific requirements.
It was like finding a star or an element. It had to be within reasonable train distance of New York, yet beyond commuting range. And it had to be suitable for painting, preferably with some hills to sit on while painting other hills. If there were interesting things between the hills, so much the better. We got a contour map covering territory about 100 miles from New York and decided to try a place called Boston Corners, a hamlet in a shallow valley between the southern end of the Berkshires and a range of high hills. We moved in the furniture from the Bronx, and there we were. We had no stove during the summer. Cooking was done on a stone fireplace in the backyard. We weren't housekeeping, we were camping in a vacant house.
At Boston Corners, Milne was soon painting, but had trouble ridding himself of the heaviness of his Bronx pictures. Then things began to happen. He started experimenting with watercolor wash and developed a technique he would use often to great effect. But the important change at Boston Corners was the lightness and freedom that appeared in his work.
I don't remember how long it took for the ease and steadiness of life at Boston Corners to have a noticeable effect on painting. A few months, perhaps. It was a good painting place because it was a good place for a painter to live. Demands were fewer than in any other place I knew.
An enterprising plan to provide posters for phonograph record dealers in several states paid off. Milne found himself sending off a packing case full of orders each month.
These posters never had anything to do with painting. The further apart the two were, the better I liked it. My right and left hands never knew what they were doing between the 10th and the 20th of each month. It was only when the big red box on the wheelbarrow was seen trundling across the field and along the main street of Boston Corners that painting again took over.
Boston Corners. It was here that David Milne achieved true maturity as an artist. 28 years after he painted this work, the National Gallery of Canada was to pay him $500 for it, the most he would get for a painting in his whole lifetime. But by January 1918, when Milne painted nearby Millerton, New York, he had already committed himself to a different life.
Since the Sunday morning in August 1914, when I sat on a shady hillside and read of the first events of the war in the Sunday Times, I had been very much interested in it as an onlooker. Now things were different. Russia was out. The United States was in, but moving very slowly. The war wasn't going well. That was the fall of 1917, and I was 35, married.
Private Milne of the Canadian Army did what most ordinary soldiers do: drilled, paraded, and shoveled. One thing he did not do for nearly a year was paint, and the war was over before he could see action. But Milne saw the battlefields as a Canadian war artist. In France and Belgium, with the violence over, he interpreted the silent aftermath.
Over this ground in the sunny days of June 1919, I made my way and painted, mostly undisturbed. On many days I saw no one and heard no sound near or far except the sound of birds. The earth had been torn up and torn up and torn up again, and from it at every step, rifles and bayonets and twisted iron posts and wire projected. Shell hole merged with overlapped shell hole, and everywhere was the litter of shell fragments, cartridges, shell cases, and dud shells, big and little. Water bottles of 3 nations, boots and uniforms. The boots often with socks and feet in them. Some shell holes, even on top of the ridge, had water in them. And over all, the sweet, sickish, but not offensive smell of death. I had no feeling of sadness about the battles in this place. No feeling at all except of interest and of amazement at the effort. The fighting perhaps was too hard to grasp. The effort, the labor, was still evident at every step.
Before 1919 was over, Milne and his wife Patsy were back in Boston Corners, New York, in the same house where the surroundings had earlier provided such fine inspiration.
No painting subject has ever hit me quite as hard as Boston Corners from up the hill. I did a good many winter pictures. Some in the open, but most from a painting house I built in Jolie's field. It was just big enough for me to crawl into and to hold me and my equipment when I was sitting down. The house just kept the wind off.
To Milne, each painting was a learning experience as well as a creative one. He had by now, 1920, established what was to be a lifelong habit, painting different treatments at different times of the same subject.
we went to Boston Corners, I didn't even think of sales. We were too far away to continue exhibitions. We had no money to spend on frames and express. So the pictures were mostly set up on a chair and looked at on the evening of the day they were painted, then put away, unexhibited, and for the most part unseen, except maybe by Clark. Clark had foresight. He saw that painting couldn't possibly provide a way of making a living. I had a pretty good idea by that time that painting offered very little in the way of security. But for me, there was no decision to make. I had no other way of life.
It became a primitive life late in 1920. A rereading of Thoreau's Walden inspired Milne to build a hut on nearby Alander Mountain and spend a solitary winter there painting. Patsy went to New York to get a job. That winter, he wrote down every detail of his existence in a diary which was both a ritual and an essential of his solitary sojourn on the mountain.
No wind in our sheltered valley. Trees not so heavily coated. No fog today, though foggy yesterday. No tracks of people. Some animal has followed the trail most of the way, tracked like a dog. Hear a jay across the ravine and the steady rush of the creek. Very still. Dropping of snow from the branches has a splashy sound. Cracklings and clickings all through the woods. Warming air is loosening the ice on the higher branches. Steady rushing of creek, almost identical with the wind in the hemlocks. Cannot tell which is which until you turn and hear the trees at the side where there's no river. Brook makes rushing sound, every once in a while a more throaty sound. I listen thinking it's people's voices.
When the warm weather came, I painted farther away from the cabin, usually taking my lunch with me and making a fire at noon. The favorite painting place was a small waterfall at the edge of a large clearing Clark and I had come through on our first trip. I painted several pictures, slow, precise, thin-lined pictures in oil. The most successful was the white waterfall, the father of the next summer's painting and more pictures since. Simplification by line, worked over, and blank spaces. Patiently worked, faulty picture, but it has a kick, and I never have been able to improve it.
With spring, it was time to leave Alander Mountain, and within a few days, Milne wrote again to Clark.
May 16th, 1921. Dear Clark, every time I think of the peaceful little refuge, it makes me homesick. This affection for a place hits me in greater or lesser degree very often. Usually when I finish a sketch and look down at the trampled spot on the ground, I have a sharp feeling of regret at leaving it. I seem to have had a succession of uprootings from places that I would be perfectly content to stay in, rather like a plant that has been set out and dug up too many times.
The Milnes settled that next summer at a small resort on Dart's Lake in the Adirondacks. Patsy worked in the office, and David Milne was handyman half the time and painter the rest.
Work was steady at darts, and so was the painting. I worked in watercolor. Changes forced by the war records work and partial development since began to bear fruit there. The overburden of detail was lost and the precision retained. The darts pictures might be described as line drawings in color. Shape was all important. Color was a mere agent in simplifying the form. The chief means of simplification was form itself, a contrast of open and worked over spaces. Open and shut painting was Clark's name for it.
Sometimes Milne used techniques of one medium in another, and when he went back to oils during a winter in Mount Rega, he used the dry brush scratching on of color that was so characteristic of his watercolors. James Clark had bought a house at Mount Rega. It needed repairs, so there was accommodation and part-time work available. Milne became carpenter, bricklayer, and paperhanger, as well as artist and diarist for the next 2 winters. And here he also tried a new medium, dry point etching in color.
I'd been thinking of it for some years. A long, quiet winter at Mount Rega seemed a good time to try out my plan. I got some pieces of hardware store copper and zinc and cut them into plates. I had no press, but thought a clothes wringer would do for experiment. We had no clothes wringer, so I borrowed Mrs. Kay's.
Milne went through the complex process of waxing, etching with a large sewing needle, heating the plates, coating them with color, buffing and printing one on top of the other.
It worked!
The subjects were usually taken from his paintings, and this oil provided the first one. The color dry point idea was put aside for lack of proper equipment, and before he would try again, Milne would have survived several more uprootings. Through a plan developed with the generous James Clark, the next stop was Big Moose Lake in the Adirondacks. Milne was to build a house with material bought by Clark. Patsy was to run a tea house. As it turned out, there were 7 summers at Big Moose, with winters spent at Lake Placid. It took 5 years to build the house. Though at times David Milne was little more than a Sunday painter, he was once again painting on one hill while looking at other hills, with interesting things in between. And one day, after a nap in the sun, something set off the fuse, as he said in a letter to Clark.
Well, the scene within is passable, but it is the frame that grips your heart. Black prongs of spruce branches lying on the ground. Thick black trunks of standing spruce. I saw the thing when I woke because the sun had crept round to the side and marked things more vigorously than before.
The scene, which Milne called Painting Place, became a project that occupied him on and off for 5 years.
I have added to the picture. Nestled along the lower edge among the black sticks, a 2-quart jar with coffee, a cup, some papers and a writing pad. They give a fine, brilliant sparkle to the foreground, and the rounded shapes are tremendously effective among the prongs.
The subject was still with him when Milne finally got the right equipment to pursue dry point etching. James Clark provided the press, and in return was to receive the first good pull of each dry point. Soon afterwards, through Clark's recommendation, Milne was commissioned to do 3,000 prints for a book collector's quarterly. But the prestigious assignment turned out to be a nightmare as plates broke down under the stress of too large a run. The job took 7 months and about 75 grueling printing sessions. The subject had taken Milne from New York State to Ontario, to Mogamy, Weston, and finally the small town of Palgrave.
It was the perfect place, much like the places I had been used to in my youth and in the States. In the 3 years, I was never away from the village overnight. This was fine. A painter needs a smooth-flowing life, at least if he goes at it in my way, progressing slowly from one phase to another. The depression didn't seem to make much difference. Artists stand depressions quite well. Depressions look so much like their regular brand of prosperity.
With painting crates and a bed for furniture and rent at $6 a month, the Milnes survived, and the painter continued to write long letters to Clark, most of them exploring the processes of painting, both physical and emotional.
In the rare day, you can do no wrong. That is aesthetic emotion, aesthetic feeling. Better, aesthetic quickening. It comes from the elements of the art. In painting, from color and line. Like animal emotions, aesthetic quickening differs entirely from reason. It isn't steady. It is either increasing or decreasing, and rapidly. There's no limit to its intensity except your own strength, your own capacity. Anything that slows you up or interrupts you allows it to dissipate and leaves you helpless. It doesn't figure in the life of the man who looks over your shoulder and expects you to take a minute off and talk. He can't see that a minute makes any difference. It may take only a minute to pull the bung out of your barrel and drain you.
Milne had more problems than being interrupted by strangers. His marriage had been disintegrating for some time. He and Patsy rarely spoke. Despite this, his output at Palgrave was remarkably strong. With spring 1933 came another separation for the Milnes, this time legal separation. The artist found a piece of land on 6 Mile Lake where he could build a cabin. It was crown land and cost only $10 a year. Here, Milne would spend the next 6 years of his life, summer and winter.
Life on the point was ruled by the almanac. On mild and sunny days, I did some painting direct in the open, but when the weather was bad, my clothes weren't warm enough. I worked inside from pencil sketches and from things in the cabin.
You know how a new wooden box looks inside when it comes with things from Eaton's? Clean, new-cut wood, peach color or flesh color. Ridiculously simple, but very difficult for me to get. During the winter, there was little variation in the pattern of days and weeks. Twice a week, usually, I went over to the big chute to get the mail. Scotty Angus gathered mine up with his. When early spring came, I started a maple syrup enterprise with Scotty.
We had discussions on art, too. Scotty was, in a way, an authority. In his young days, he had been a picture framer in Glasgow. When considering my life and work, he couldn't see how anyone could expect to sell pictures in the bush. That difficulty wasn't only Scotty's.
More than geography prevented painting sales. The pictures were not framed, nor could Milne afford to send them back and forth to exhibitions. One of his Palgrave paintings, however, had been purchased by two people with a growing reputation as patrons of the arts. They were Vincent and Alice Massey. Massey was yet to become the first native-born Governor-General of Canada. Milne made the Masseys an astonishing proposal.
What I have in mind is not the sale of a picture, but of a lifetime of pictures, about 1,000 of them. To set some sort of bounds to my proposal, I put a price of $5 each on them, good or bad, as they come. It isn't large enough to have made their painting a profitable or even possible enterprise. Yet it is enough to ensure years of continuous undisturbed painting for the artist with simple tastes.
Best work of Cézanne, Degas, Renoir, and Rousseau went to helpful and discerning patrons, often at prices well under $100. Yet those transactions are the ones that have to do with the making of art. All the millions spent on Holbeins, El Grecos, Rembrandts, and other masters after their death did nothing, except to move their pictures around a bit.
The Masseys did agree to buy 300 paintings, and later, despite Milne's belief that the paintings would be kept together, they arranged to sell a number of them through the Mellors Gallery in Toronto, the profits to go to Milne. It looked like the end to Milne's poverty, but the Masseys had kept prices very low to encourage sales, and gallery expenses for framing, advertising, and commission took care of the profits. However, in 1934, at 52, Milne was being exhibited regularly for the first time in his life. The exhibition did bring two new friends who sought him out at 6 Mile Lake. One was Alan Jarvis, who 20 years later would be director of the National Gallery of Canada. The other was Douglas Duncan, who had just bought a Milne painting. They came to the cabin many times, on skis in the winter and for picnics in the summer.
I remember the picnics particularly because we always seemed to forget to take some important item. Baked beans without a can opener. Tea without anything to make it in.
Duncan and Jarvis became trusted friends to Milne and critics and connoisseurs of his work. One winter, they had a bonfire with unusual fuel.
A great many early pictures had been sent up from the States, and we went through all of them. We had a big picture burning. Months and months of hard work ended in smoke and a nasty smell, but without loss of anything of possible interest to me or anyone else.
Douglas Duncan had become increasingly important in David Milne's life. Milne was dissatisfied with previous arrangements for the handling of his paintings, so he made Duncan his agent and manager and began to exhibit at Duncan's new Picture Loan Society in Toronto. The solitude at 6 Mile Lake was beginning to tell on Milne. To the over-detailing of business matters in Douglas Duncan's letters, he began to react with impatience and anger.
Don't write any more about it. Don't write any more about anything. Don't write at all. I am trying to get a little painting done. For 15 months, I have been clinging desperately to the thin thread of painting and having it broken by such confusion as this.
Confusion was compounded by Patsy's continual pestering and her refusal to admit she was out of Milne's life.
These letters have only done harm to both of us, and for me have become periodically repeated irritation. There never was any chance in the last 10 years that we could live happily together.
Milne suggested a divorce. Now someone else had come into his life. She was a nurse named Kathleen Pavey who had vacationed at the lake. And when she began her relationship with David Milne, she was taking on a man who needed help.
I went up camping alone, going past his place. Well, it was a terrible day, and I had never been out on the lake. And I managed to turn the canoe and got into a bay past his place, and he was there waving his arms, you know, and directing me. Of course, you couldn't hear a word with the wind blowing. But then that night we had supper, and then that night he just went right off, you know. He paced up and down his little cabin and just burst of talk, you know. And he'd sit beside me and grab my hand, and then he'd up and off again. And, you know, I didn't know him that well. So I just sat tight, and then finally he wound down, and he put up my tent, and I got him some hot cocoa and got him to bed, and then, you know, seemed to me I'd no more got to sleep than he was out prowling around, you know. He'd just been alone too long. Oh, he was emotionally and mentally, you know, in every way, really, in a very upset state, which lasted quite a long time. For a year, several years, really.
Milne's wilderness life was soon to end. He was to begin a new kind of life in downtown Toronto, life with Kathleen. She was much younger, but willing to be Mrs. Milne and to provide the emotional support Milne needed.
The real need, I think, came out in that first year in this little apartment we had. And I went off to get washed one night. And when I came out, he was standing in the middle of the room, and he was in a state of shock. His lips were blue and he was in a cold sweat. And I got him to bed. I treated him for shock, you know. He finally got out, but he thought I'd gone. He looked around and I wasn't there. And I was in this little bathroom, you know. Well, that was the need that he had. And you don't get over things like that in a hurry, you know.
Despite his nervous and emotional problems, the artist made his year in Toronto a very productive one. David Milne had always painted what happened to be in front of him, and this work could be considered a subtle birth announcement. Milne was 59 when his son was born, and the family now settled in Uxbridge, a small town near Toronto. For the first time since his student days, Milne had a studio, and the view from its window on Main Street provided him with material. At this point, though Milne would begin with line drawing, he once again used a wash to give a soft texture with well-defined shapes underneath. As always, he set down the details in letters to Clark.
I still keep enough of the old Boston Corners method to like a clear-cut line to start with, even though it's confused or lost intentionally in places afterwards.
It was at this time, 1941, that David Milne first painted subjects from outside reality. Photographs of snow crystals provided inspiration for a picture called Snow in Bethlehem.
Snow crystals are seldom seen in relation to landscape or to anything except a piece of dark cloth or the pages of a book. So a realistic snow picture was out. But the progression from crystals to winter to Christmas to Bethlehem was easy. The title, usually the last thing to be thought of, was almost the starting point of this picture. I had embarked on a fantasy. All art has the play element. It's a delight in itself and for itself.
David Milne without a cabin in the woods was like David Milne without paints, unnatural. And in 1948, a new cabin was begun on Baptiste Lake near Bancroft, Ontario. Milne now felt that he was ready to try being alone for a time, and he re-entered the long familiar ambience of wilderness solitude in winter. As always, he wrote detailed letters filled with sketches, many to his son who'd worked with him on the cabin in summer. The cabin at Baptiste Lake was 4 years old when David Milne had to undergo a major operation for cancer. Much of his summer of recovery was spent at the lake, and by fall, he felt well enough to stay alone.
I often sat overlooking the lake, watching the performance before me. The approach of thunderstorms was particularly exciting. A slow, soundless beginning. Flashes on the clouds far beyond the opposite shore. Then some direct lightning flashes and rumblings of thunder crashing into full power before the final rush of wind and rain. Feeling is the power that drives art. There doesn't seem to be a more understandable word for it, though there are others that give something of the idea. Aesthetic emotion, quickening, bringing to life. Or call it love. Not love of man or woman or home or country or any material thing, but love without an object. Intransitive love.
When he closed the cabin just before Christmas 1951, Milne didn't know that the coming year would bring an impossible challenge. He tried to learn to paint with his left hand after 2 strokes had paralyzed his right. Then, in September 1953, David Milne suffered a major stroke. He lingered for 4 months and died the day after Christmas.